Hey, and welcome back to A Different Atheist Reads, History of God by Karen Armstrong. I'm Kristi, and in today's video, we're not going to get to Karen's book because she just does it weird. And so instead what I want to do is give you the background you need to interpret Karen so that you know what really happened, and then you can see what she did. So remember in one of the earlier videos I said that her scholarship in terms of the first few chapters wasn't very modern. It ended in the 60s and the 70s, and it didn't show any modern knowledge of current articles. Well, this is part of the reason why I pointed out, I can see the consequence now. She hasn't done a lot of research, and so things that you could really learn from aren't in there. And so I'm using the Yale course. I'm going to cover today a little bit about J and E and P and D. And I've already done a run through of this video. It's too long to just get into one. So then I'm going to do Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah in the next video. And then after that, I'll actually talk about what Karen does. So first, let me give you the historical stuff, and then we'll give you the mythology version. That sound all right? Okay, let's go. Before we start, just want to point out that my orchid, my normal orchid, which has been a trooper, it's done really fabulous, but it is getting a bit bare now. It's finally getting its winter rest. Not this bit though. This bit right here is starting a whole new bloom and a whole new blossom. But I thought I would give it the week off and give you guys a different orchid. So I hope you enjoy that. But with that fun stuff over, let's get on with the lecture. J and E were the earliest authors, and then the next development were the D school and the P school. So texts and authors that are similar, Deuteronomy and its views, and then you get the priestly source and the priestly texts, and those are writings that share a priestly theme. Now, even though D and P are written a little bit, are written after J and E, it is pretty clear from the text that they're drawing upon ancient traditions. So that although the start of the writing was from the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE, the traditions they're drawing upon are probably older than that. And another unique feature of these stories in terms of legitimacy is that whenever they put down something authoritative, it always happens either during the Exodus or the 40-year wandering. So we see both, we see the priestly source, and I'm pretty sure Deuteronomy too, going back and editing and redacting some of the texts from earlier in order to justify their current positions into older traditions. In terms of the priestly legislation, that's contained in Exodus, Leviticus, and some of Numbers. And the Deuteronomy, obviously, is the main Deuteronomic text, and then other authors who are associated with that school. The Bible is a little bit different from most holy books in that it's a history book, it's a mythological book, it's also a legal book. And you see things in the Bible that are mirrored in other pagan cultures. So one of the things that is common in law books are if-then statements. If a man knocks out his slave's tooth, then the slave shall go free. So a lot of things that tell you what to do in certain conditions. Unlike other pagan texts, the Bible has a lot of these absolute laws or commandments that are given. This is most characteristic of the Israelite writings. Things that are examples of this are love your neighbor, I am the Lord your God. The 10 Commandments are absolute laws. And it's worth pointing out that if you look at how the 10 Commandments are framed, they're only addressed to Israelite males. And that is assumed because they are the only people who are legal subjects in the community. And so it is basically from one legal subject to another that, they're passing this information, even though they're imposing it on everybody. During the lecture series, Christine Hayes is careful to point out that variations occur in Deuteronomy, that the authors will go back and change things that were existed in previous laws. So this means that from the position of the P source and the P authors and the D authors, transmission was not inerrant. It could be modified. Verbatim replication was not as valued to them as it is to us today. And we also see in different versions of the 10 Commandments the different value systems of the communities. So the D version of the 10 Commandments includes things like don't marry foreign women, observe festivals, make dedications to gods. And so this is a little bit different from the Exodus, the earliest Exodus version. Another example of how we see the authors making variation in transmission is to compare Exodus 20 which talks about intergenerational punishment being spread out over many generations as a form of mercy. And that would be because rather than all of the weight of a sin falling on one generation, God, in his mercy, spreads it out over many, so that not everyone, so they won't come down on everybody at once. But by the time the Deuteronomic school was going, you see this idea being rejected as immoral. And so punishment in Deuteronomy 7, God only punishes the guilty. And you will see Ezekiel also says this, that people are responsible, God holds people responsible individually, not collectively. So this modern claims of biblical inerrancy are actually not even justified just by looking at the evidence contained within the text in terms of the theological perspectives and the theological fluidity that we see represented. In the lecture series, there is, I think, a worthy amount of time and attention given to Greenberg and his ideas about how Israelite law was both similar and dissimilar from its pagan neighbors. In the other Near Eastern traditions, gods give the power to the king, and then the king hands down the laws to the people in order to keep domestic tranquility and the common weal and help the poor and these, sort of noble goals. But in the Bible, God is both the king and the God. So it is not the king giving the law, but God giving the law. As a consequence, the scope of the law is broader. Israelite law is much more than just concerned with murder and keeping the peace. It is holistic. It has social commands, ethical commands, moral and religious prescriptions, and they're given in an absolute style, especially those that are completely unenforceable. They will be followed by the phrase, "I am the Lord your God." Right? So, love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord your God. There are no similar commands of ethical behavior in foreign neighbors, probably for this reason, that the laws were not given from a God, but in order to keep civil society. But this means that within the Israelite law, you get norms for human behavior that are set by the divine will. And this has implications, as we will see, in terms of how that is then enacted in a society. So in particular, what I want to say to connect this is that you don't get preference based on class. Because of, in my view, and Christine Hayes didn't say this, so this is my speculation, because of a violation of the divine will, it doesn't matter if you're a foreign person or a high upper class person or a lower class person, it's still broken. So there's no ability to have different grades of an upper class person sins, well then it's not bad. No, sin is sin. And so I think that's where that fundamental equality comes from. Another implication of God being the source of law is that now the difference between morality and crime is gone. So every crime is a sin and every sin is a crime. What's immoral is illegal, what is illegal is immoral. And that is because of the dictates of divine will. And this is why you get these calls, because the commands are not just about keeping civil society, but about keeping a good society. You get calls or appeals to be kind to widows, to show respect to elders, to legislate charity, how to do that, and compassion. So the fusion of law and morality, which is kept separate in our modern culture, there is no distinction in the Israelite law. As I said, these laws do show distinct patterns from their pagan neighbors. They have motive clauses. They explain why God wants things done. And there are two main appeals. Either there are appeals back to slavery and your experience as a slave. You should be kind to the foreigner because you were once a foreigner. And the idea that God is holy and people should try to imitate God. And if you want to imitate God, the best way to do that is to, be kind and be upright and be moral. So it's an imitation of God that justifies it. Finally, we can compare the idea of who is the vulnerable in society in the priestly text and in the Deuteronomy school by looking at who they list as being the vulnerable in society. In terms of the priestly text in Leviticus, the widow, orphan, and poor are mentioned. And in Deuteronomy, it's the widow, the orphan, and stranger. And the poor, you don't just give charity to the poor, you give them loans. So just to point out again that there isn't that unified view of what God wants, the different schools had different approaches to these topics. Another example of later authors changing the text can be seen in slavery. Slavery existed, obviously, very early on in the Bible text, but over time, you see some changes and modifications and ameliorations being included. Now, the last thing I want to get into in terms of the P tradition is to give you a bit of an insight into the role of ritual and symbolism and the worldview behind it. So if we look at the text, or when scholars look at the texts, they identify several things about it. First, it's a sacrificial system. You can see the establishment of the priestly clan in the text. Then you get a description of the ritual and the purity laws, including a description of what to do on the highest, holiest day, Yom Kippur. And then there's this separate sort of holiness code, or H as it's called, a later work that they think that was done by a redactor. In terms of the scholarship in field of biblical scholarship that has engaged with the ritual literature and the purity literature, it was rather dismissive in the sort of 19th and early part of the 20th century. But as anthropologists and ethnologists and other people who have been influenced by the social sciences became involved in investigating these questions, attitudes toward the purity rituals changed. And in particular, Mary Douglas is someone Christine Hayes cites as an anthropologist who really made a huge contribution in terms of changing it from a legalistic view, sort of the way that Christians maligned the Pharisees, sort of like that, oh, it's just ritual, it's not important, to instead see it as symbolism. And when we do that, there's actually some kind of interesting perspectives, I think, that come out of the text. Like the rest of the ancient world, the Israelites had a cultic system. It had a sanctuary, and in that sanctuary there were sacred objects, and that is where the priest, the high priest, performed ritual acts, and other priests performed, things around the temple. But the sanctuary itself was the dwelling space of the deity. And the reason why priests performed daily rituals was to attract the presence of God and keep the presence of God near his people in order that he might provide his protections and his blessings and not curse them and abandon them. This location that God dwelled in was, of course, the holiest of places. And from that radiated out increasingly less and less holiness until things just became ordinary. Therefore, in order to get near that holiness, you needed increasing levels of purity. And that is where the purity rituals come in. Now, I think it is worth pointing out that if you can put yourself in this mindset where you are living in a camp, and imagine over the road for where you are right now, it was where the temple started. You just happened to camp near the start of the temple. And that meant that you were physically within reach of God. I mean, God was only like right over there, and you couldn't go to him unless you were the high priest, but he was like living, he was like your neighbor, right down the street. And when the priests performed these ceremonies, the sprinkling of the blood on the ark on Yom Kippur was thought to be God's footstool. So the holiest man in the holiest place on the holiest day performing a ritual in order to maintain God's presence. And if you actually think that you have to do that to maintain, to avoid war and famine and everything else, this is, I think, a little bit closer to the mentality that we should be approaching the text rather than our modern kind of distant, transcendent, God is other. God was very real to them. God was very physical and was located, within their midst. And I think that definitely helps present a legitimizing rationale for why these rituals were so important. Within the priestly worldview, God was entirely holy and therefore entirely separate from human beings and the common world. God was intrinsically holy, and God could sanctify things. When God sanctifies an object, it means that it now belongs to God. It is free for God to use that object. So anything, again, there are two notions of purity. One is ritual purity, and the other one is moral purity. And the ritual purity really just has to do with trying to aspire to the divine. So rather than being associated with death and sex, God is asexual and immortal, so you don't have sex before you go in the presence of God, right? Because that is a reminder to God of how not like him you are. If you are ritually pure, you can come in contact with sacred objects. If you are ritually impure, you cannot come into contact with sacred objects. And perhaps counterintuitively, when scholars looked through the text, it does not appear to be the case that impurity is associated with evil spirits. It's not related to cleanliness either. And I think people do that as a rationale, trying to figure out why would people have these rules. But if we look at it perhaps from a symbolic point of view, what those scholars have identified is that there are really, the symbolisms for impurity have to do either with death, that is touching corpses or coming in contact with death, or there's particular skin disease that appeared to make you look like you were dead, and so that made you impure, and genital discharges, whether it's through sex or any like a sexual disease, any of that would also make you ritually impure. The idea here being that because God is immoral, because God is immortal and asexual, to be like God requires that you also be not associated with death or birth, with sex or with death. And this attempt to imitate God through ritual purity and obtaining ritual purity is also seen as the basis of animal sacrifice, another attempt to be like God. Just as God has control of life or death over his creatures, his humans, so humans have control over the life or death of animals. And I don't know if I buy that one as much, but it's interesting, so you can check out the whole lecture if you want to learn more. Again, with the mindset that God is over there and he is hanging out and he is protecting us, the priests did daily rituals in order to maintain God's presence and to keep God, near his people, attract him back if he was wandering away. So the problem was not only ritual purity, because those were practices that were common in pagan, rituals as well. Because of this fusion of the religion and the law, now sins become sources of moral impurity as well. And so you can't, it's not just violating, say, coming in contact with a corpse and being near death and then offending God with your reminder of your mortality. Now, if you worship the wrong God, you are coming foul of God's will. So idolatry, homicide, and sexual transgressions are seen as particularly bad sins that not only sort of bring about ritual, your moral impurity, but it actually defiles what is sacred, and it defiles the physical land itself. And therefore, this is the basis of the idea that if people in an area keep committing sins, that the land itself becomes so tainted with its moral impurity that God actually leaves. God comes up out of the place and moves off. And that is why it's really important to maintain ritual purity, and also why there's all these calls for to abandon the practice of foreign gods and to not engage in sexual transgression, because they're calling on people to not drive God away, to not drive God physically out of the land. And land cannot be purified, not from moral impurity. Ritual impurity, I believe I get this right, can be driven out with the Yom Kippur ritual once a year. But moral impurity just seeps into the land like gasoline, and eventually the people are thrown out. And this is what explains exiles, right? The first exile and the threats of exile, being thrown out of the land because it's so now repulsive to God. As for the role of blood in ritual, I do want to just take a little time out and say something about this, because it grosses me out. Like, the emphasis on blood in religious, in Christianity in particular, just really grosses me out. And I never quite understood it until I spent some time on this lecture series. And so, having learned something, I would like to pass it on to you. In the priestly worldview, and probably generally within the religious community, but of course, within the priests who were concerned with rituals, this would be of paramount concern. Blood was life force, and life force was God's. So life came from God, blood contained life force, therefore that blood belongs to God. It's not for humans to take that because it doesn't belong to us. And that's why it's considered sinful to eat flesh with the blood still in it, because you're consuming something that belongs to God. It doesn't belong to you. And this letting of blood, the use of blood as purification, it is tapping into this life force notion, this idea that that's God's property. A yearly ritual was required to remove ritual impurities and other impurities, or God would be driven out of the land entirely, and the people would be left without blessing or protection. So this again, this notion of your conduct you're doing something we don't approve of, puts us all at risk for destruction. I see this still being discussed today when there's a hurricane and Pat Robertson comes up and tries to blame it on somebody. And I definitely see this mental link between moral impurity and national threat as being, really found in these texts right here. Next time, we're going to cover Ezekiel, 2nd Isaiah, Job, and Proverbs, because that's what Karen does in the section. Even though she starts to drift a little into the Greeks, she also talks about wisdom literature and Proverbs. So I want to talk about those too. And if you are looking for more content to get you through the holidays, if you don't have enough to do, please check out my 12 Days of Kristi holiday series that's here on this channel. I have also got a new series out on secular TV called Get Smarter. And on that show, I do reviews of YouTube content that might be of particular interest for atheists or people interested in secular topics. The first review I did was on a talk by Lawrence Krauss. And this week I'll be doing a review of a talk given by Bart Ehrman on Jesus Interrupted. So I hope you guys will check that out. Otherwise, I've been Kristi, you have been awesome, and thank you so much for watching. Bye.